like Storm from the X-Men, Alphaba, like all these really strong, powerful women owning their own power, I think have always been something that I've felt a connection to in some way, and I see as role models.
Hey everyone, it's Samantha, and welcome back to another episode of Paths. Paths is a program of LGBT tech that is focused on visibility and inclusion of LGBTQ+ folks in STEAM. Paths podcast allows us to talk to professionals across the LGBTQ+ community in various STEAM fields and get to hear their stories, from their background to how they got to where they are, to their advice for others on how to get into their fields and industries. Everyone's paths vary, are unique, and are incredibly insightful. Before we jump into this month's episode, don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe to show your support and never miss another episode.
Hi.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today and participate in the Paths interview. Could we just have you start by sharing your name with us as well as your pronouns and tell us a little bit about how your friends would describe you?
My name is Brian. I use he, him pronouns. My friends would describe me as kind. I think probably is the biggest word. And then caring. I'm a Cancer, so I feel like I fit that bill.
And could you tell us how do you identify within the LGBTQ+ community, and also please feel free to recognize any other parts of your identity that are important to you?
Sure. So I'm a cis gay man, and then I am also Jewish, and I have a learning disability as well.
And could you tell us a little bit about what you do professionally, and could you also tell us how you would describe it to somebody who's never heard of your profession before?
Sure. So I'm a UX designer, and I design software within the financial space. That's generally how I describe it. I think someone who doesn't know what UX is, I usually say I help people solve problems.
And could you tell us a little bit about where you grew up and also where are you living now? And can you describe a little bit about what your community looked like growing up?
So I grew up in Westchester County, New York, just outside of New York City, and I'm here now in New York City. My community was like fairly homogenized, like very similar. I think a lot of other Jewish folks in my town, a lot of other white people in my town, not a lot of gay people in my area as well. But it was like quiet, quaint suburban life.
How long have you been in New York City for?
I've lived in New York for the last 15 years.
Okay, awesome. And do you remember when you first started kind of understanding your LGBTQ+ identity, and like what was that like for you?
So I first started realizing I was gay when I was in middle school, and it was really scary. I think it's, a lot of unwanted feelings, a lot of worrying about if people will find out. It was sort of during the AIDS crisis, so I think there was a lot of fear associated with that as well, of what does that mean for me if this is true? And so I kind of just ignored it for as long as I could, and then I stopped at one point ignoring.
And did you have access to queer spaces or communities as a young person?
Not really. In high school, there was a GSA, but it was still at a time when joining that might mean something. And it was, I wasn't okay being out at that moment. So in theory, yes. In actuality, not really.
And do you remember what your first kind of access to queer spaces looked like and when that was?
I think it was probably college. There was a GSA at my college, and I met my best friend through joining it. I don't know. I mean, it was nice to feel like I could be myself and like I didn't have to worry about what other people might think. I think in college, it also, it was still at a time when being gay was maybe not so comfortable, but in college, it's a little bit easier to hide. The town that I grew up in was 7,000 people, so it's a lot smaller of a space. So it's easier to blend in, I guess.
And do you remember if you had any role models growing up, and that could be within the community or it could be in any other parts of your life?
So I think a lot of my role models, it's funny that they're sort of coming back into relevance today in some way, but I think Storm from the X-Men, Alphaba, all these really strong, powerful women owning their own power, I think have always been something that I've felt a connection to in some way, and I see as role models.
Yeah, I love that. So shifting into STEAM, do you remember what kind of first sparked your interest in UX design or kind of in your field as a whole?
Sure. So the degree program that I went to was more of a general graphic design degree. I don't think I set out wanting to be in user experience. let alone within the financial space. It kind of found me, and I like to say it chose me, as I think is a common experience for anybody finding themselves in the financial UX space. I graduated during, I don't know, it was 2010, so it was like, the market collapsed, job market was really tough, so I managed to find a job at a financial software company. It was working as a visual designer, not necessarily UX designer. I don't know, I really enjoyed it. I was there for about 4 years and loved kind of problem solving and the complexity of it and the sort of interesting problems and using art to solve kind of different kinds of problems.
And do you remember, was there like kind of a moment or a time when you realized like, this is what I want to do, and like how you made that decision?
After about 4 years at my first job, I was like, I don't know that this is what I want to do. I was, tired of working in a corporate environment, and I went to join a startup, and I was in their marketing department. And I think honestly, I missed the challenges that came with the space that I was in, both, going from UX adjacent work to like putting a logo on a pen is really a dull way to spend your time. So I think after about a year of putting logos on pens, I was tired of it and ready to move on.
And yeah, could you kind of talk us through like what your educational path into like graphic design and then UX design looked like, and kind of thinking about folks who might be interested in a career in UX, but like might not know kind of what route they should take?
Sure. So I think UX is one of those fields that people come into it from a lot of different directions. Now there's like actual degree programs, but that wasn't really common outside of, I think, literally Stanford was the only place when I was growing up, and no one knew what that field was anyway, so it didn't matter. I think for me, I sort of found myself in there, and it is really in some ways related to graphic design, right? You're using similar tools that you might use to design something for graphics as you would in some sort of online space. I think from there, I had a lot of training by asking questions, being curious, and working with more traditional interaction designers. This was at a time when these roles were really separate, and I kind of crossed that bridge into UX proper. I think for folks who are kind of interested in the field, there's definitely a lot of programs that will help you with, learning about UX. I think the thing that's always a struggle about them that I think is maybe worthwhile to highlight in this format is like, there's an element of craft that I think those programs don't teach you. So if you're going through one of those programs, I think really focusing on how to up-level your taste, your objectivity, and your ability to think critically about the work that you're doing, that going through like a traditional graphic design program that I went through, part of it really is learning how to be objective about your own work.
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting, like you're talking about being in a field that wasn't exactly around when you were in college, like just a few years ago, and thinking about folks who are interested in getting into that job market and like how it could be so different in just a few years from now. So it seems like it takes a lot of just like openness and the ability to adapt and everything as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much changing with this industry right now with AI. I think in a lot of spaces where people are maybe doing simpler things, there's maybe more that could be replaced. But like, I would say 40% of my job is actually designing something, and the other 60% is like trying to understand the problem that I'm solving and like working with people to make sure they understand the problems that they're trying to solve. And I think we're far away from that, but I think that that's something that people overlook about UX, is that a lot of it is partnership with other people that you're working with.
I think that's important for people to hear too, that like there's so much of it that's not replaceable. I think across the tech industry in general and across many industries, it's important to like there's so many conversations about what is replaceable with AI, but I think it's really important to highlight the things that are not replaceable, especially with where AI is at right now. And
yeah.
I guess kind of as you were starting out in your field and as you've been navigating your field over the past, like 15 or so years, I guess even back in college, like have you felt like there's space for LGBTQ folks in UX / in like the wider tech or finance industries in general?
So I think in general, UX and any design profession is going to be a really liberal one. And I've found that to be true throughout my career. In my first job, I was not out to anyone except my manager. at the time, which I think maybe sounds surprising, but she's someone who I'm still very close to this day. You know, I certainly have experienced discomfort, and I think I do in some ways in the financial space. Like, it's very heteronormative, very like cis male dominated, that like oftentimes I find myself in a room where maybe I'm with a lot of other people that are like me, but I'm also with a lot of people that are different than me. And so it can be hard to relate in some of those circumstances. I don't think I've ever felt like I wasn't welcome. The types of companies that I've worked for get villainized for their appeared support for those communities. But as someone who's worked with a lot of them, I've never felt excluded. I've seen a lot of rainbow flags on a lot of desks as time has progressed, and I think it's always made me feel happy. And even now in the current political climate, while it's softened a little bit, it's not gone. And you know, my coworkers are still the same people, and they have no qualms about me. So
yeah. You mentioned one thing about like being able to be out to your manager at work, and why is that important in a workplace? And kind of, can you talk about that a little bit?
With her specifically, I think what was odd about it is that I think if you're closeted, I'm not sure that your first inkling is to come out to your manager as the first person. In her case, she was someone who taught me a ton, and she had a sister who was a lesbian. And I think I like came out accidentally. Like, she was mentioning that her sister and her sister-in-law went to Mexico and like, you know, I don't know, felt comfortable. And I was like, oh yeah, I never noticed anything. And it was just like casual conversation. And I think for me, it's just what I've taken away from that moment as someone who's now managing people, as bringing my whole self to work is so important. I think it wasn't so much as it was important to be out to my manager as it was to feel comfortable to be out at work. I think in that first job, I never really felt comfortable to be out. I mean, this was still before gay marriage was legal. It was a very different time in some ways. And so it did still feel like a risk of some sort. You know, I think in the jobs that I've accepted afterwards, I think because of my comfort level with my manager, I've never felt the need to be closeted or, you know, anything like that.
Yeah. And as somebody who's a manager now, like, would you have advice to other folks who are like managers in STEAM fields in general, who I think especially for folks who maybe aren't part of the community, but also maybe folks who are, like, how they can support employees that they have who are part of the community?
Listening is so important. Emotional intelligence is so important. I think as someone whose sort of whole existence is intersectionality, I mean, granted we all are, but like, it's often that I'm not, you know, it's rare that I'm in a room where people have like all of the same things that I have. I think it's such an important thing to bring, is paying attention to them, making sure that they feel comfortable, inviting them into those spaces, and bringing your whole self as well, and demonstrating that they can do that because you're able to do that.
Yeah. Like, you've kind of started to talk about this, but have you felt comfortable being out at different workplaces that you had, and what kind of support or challenges beyond what you mentioned have you had?
In general, you know, I've never felt like it wasn't okay to be out. I think I've worked in places where some of my coworkers are not within the tri-state area, and that becomes, you know, something to think about, navigate, and consider. I mean, I've never felt overtly uncomfortable. I think everywhere that I've been has been explicitly, you know, an ally to some degree. I think one of the things that I always look for when I'm looking at jobs is their policies on healthcare coverage. In particular, and it's, you know, less of a thing now than it was, you know, than it's been since gay marriage, although I think it's maybe increasing in relevance given the political situation. But like, what are their policies around domestic partnership and supporting coverage for that, as well as like gender affirming care, both for the person who works there, but also their dependents, is a really great way to understand where an organization really fits.
Yeah, I think that's a really like good piece of advice for folks who are job searching and wanting to know, like, you know, a company can say that they have inclusive policies or whatnot, but like, you know, being able to really ask those questions about things like healthcare coverage and benefits and if they're inclusive.
Well, you don't even have to ask about it, which is, I think, what's really beneficial, because it's hard when you're in that circumstance of like, you've got the offer, you've got the benefits, and you don't want to do anything where they're going to pull that offer away. And it's horrible to be in that situation, but I don't think that fear will ever go away. So they provide you that information. It's all in your benefits package. And if they don't, then you can ask for that.
Yeah. And I guess based on your personal experiences, do you feel like STEAM fields as a whole, or you can talk specifically to your industry, do you think there are barriers posed for entry for LGBTQ folks?
I think absolutely. I think the interview process in general for a lot of these things they tend to not be the most inclusive, right? I'm trying to think through. I don't think I've ever been interviewed by another gay Jew in any sort of process that I'm aware of. And that's difficult, right? It's hard to be under a microscope and then feel like you're by yourself. I think within UX, you're often in a panel of people. And so I think it would be silly to say it's not. I think there's places that are better at it. There's places that are really conscious and thinking about hiring and thinking about it in a thoughtful way, which I think is so important. But then I think when you get in the door as well, like I was going through a promotion process at one of my former roles, and it's so geared around like this sort of culture of cis men and like how they talk to each other, how they advocate for each other, how they communicate. I had to be paraded around this managing director to be able to like get the nod of approval that I was ready, despite the fact that I had been demonstrating the skills for a long time. But like all these things stem from a culture of people that, are very different from me. So I think, no, it's not.
Yeah.
There's barriers to entry.
And do you feel like your perspective or background have been truly valued in the spaces that you work in? And I guess like kind of building on that, like what do you feel like you've been able to bring into your work because of your lived experience that somebody of a different lived experience might not be able to bring into the work in the same way?
So I think so much about UX is like how you think about the problem and how you think around it. I think both being a member of the queer community and also even like my learning disability, I think about things differently than a lot of other people. That can range from like, sometimes, I've worked in spaces where we're dealing with wealth management, where like thinking about non-traditional families is actually like a really important thing because it's a use case that you have to think of. And most of the time, people don't think about it. So it's helpful to be able to bring those perspectives. But I think it's even just more broadly, like having the ability to be flexible in your thinking is such an important skill for any good UX designer that it's helpful to have a different perspective. And diversity is so important for obvious reasons, but I think in UX in particular, it really, really helps and you can see the benefit.
Yeah. Especially thinking about in fields such as like finance, for example, that like a lot of folks in our community and just like different communities don't have access to a lot of kind of financial resources and things like that from like, from their families and things like that. And so thinking about like I'm neurodivergent, and so managing finances is like a really difficult thing because a lot of it's not built around like supporting folks with neurodivergence, and like a lot of it can be really overwhelming. And so having things that are not designed to be like neurodivergent friendly can like, that can just make me give up in the process of, trying to do something that's really important. So like having folks who are thinking about those kinds of things from the design perspective is so important to making sure that folks are included in that and have access to those tools. And I guess in an ideal world, like what would a truly inclusive and equitable STEAM space look like to you?
Diverse slates and hiring panels is so important.
Yeah.
Having both respect for non-traditional education paths, but also like making sure and contributing back that those non-traditional education paths are better than they are, because I think sometimes they're not always the best.
Yeah. And could you tell us about a project that you've loved working on and what made it exciting and meaningful to you?
So I think that there's two that I've worked on that I would highlight. I think one was some work that I did for an algorithmic trading dashboard. It was very data intensive, and it was really interesting to both work with all of the complex data, learn about the processes that go into it, and like what a really extremely smart people are doing to make decisions to move millions and sometimes billions of dollars. And it's kind of weird to have that responsibility. And so it was so fun to like solve that problem and work through that. I think another one would be this work that I did with two-factor authentication. It was one of those problems where, you know, you pulled a loose thread on a sweater and the entire thing unraveled. And so not only did I get to unravel the entire sweater, but I also got to like put it back together and solve a lot of the problems there. It was just a lot of fun to be able to go through that process and like research the problem, both qualitatively, quantitatively, solve a lot of the pain points that people had and were highlighting, and be able to solve the problems that these people had. So
if this is a different answer or not, but what are you most proud of in your career so far?
One of my former direct reports telling me that I can read the future. As someone who believes they're emotionally intelligent and then is also an anxious person, I think it's like really easy to like be like, I think this might happen. And then when you do it enough times that someone's like, you can read the future. I'm like, yeah, I can sometimes.
I love the reframing of anxiety. It's kind of a superpower in a way.
It can be.
Yeah.
I don't want it though.
I feel that. And what are some professional and personal goals that you want to achieve?
Professionally, my goal right now is to just kind of be happy. I think that that's both a professional goal and a personal goal. And I think normally I advocate for work-life separation, but in this one, I think it's not. I think with everything that's going on right now, like protecting my peace, which means like not going crazy and spending every living hour and thought that I have around work is important, but also like spending my time outside of work refilling my own cup is so important.
Yeah, it definitely is. And outside of work, are there things that you love to do? Do you have any hobbies or passions?
I, on a whim, signed up for some random program for doing art, and I've been really enjoying doing like lots of physical art. I mean, I stare at a computer screen all the time creating things, that it's so nice to like go back to a sheet of paper and a pencil.
Very cool. What mediums of art are you studying?
I've been doing lots of drawing, block printing, and then a lot of clay as well.
In your opinion, like what would a better world for LGBTQ individuals look like? Like in your perfect world, what is something that you would like to see?
I think in a perfect world, it's just actual equity, right? Which like we're moving farther away from that rather than closer to it right now, which is hard to contend with, but it's the goal.
And what advice would you give to your younger self, knowing everything that you know now?
I think probably you are qualified is a good one. And I think ask more questions is another good one. And I think worry less about what other people think and how they may perceive you, believing that you're qualified and asking those questions.
Yeah. And if you had advice to give to younger LGBTQ folks, or just in general, the next generation of LGBTQ folks who are interested in going to STEAM fields, what advice would you leave them with?
So much is changing and so much will change by the time they get to these fields, that I think the most important thing that they can do is actually like be good communicators and problem solvers. And everything else is just a matter of like memorizing code or memorizing how tools work.
Yeah, I think that's good advice, because it's really easy to get caught up in the technical skills and whether you're qualified and things like that with those skills, but there are things that are a lot harder to teach. So for folks who have a learning disability, like is there anything that you've done or any trends that you see there?
So I think accessibility becoming so important is so interesting. It's sort of silly, but like I love this anecdote and I tell it all the time at work, that like the reason why people suddenly care about accessibility is because someone who could not see wanted to use the Domino's app to order pizza. And Domino's argument before the Supreme Court was that they can call on the phone. And the Supreme Court said, no, that's discrimination because it's like segregation, right? It's the same principle. I try to bring that perspective to the work that I'm doing when I'm talking about accessibility, which is really hard because sometimes that means organizing things in a very specific way that maybe is harder for other people to think about. And then there's, how do you contend with all the other factors that go into creating something? But I think if you're coming from that place of like actually know making something inaccessible is, the same thing as segregation, then it helps you make good decisions. I don't know.
Do you have an accessibility best practice tip that you would want to leave others? Just like if you were to see something in like the field of UX design that you were like, I wish that people just knew this. Like, do you have a tip that you would leave folks with?
So I think one thing that I always do, and I do a lot of data visualization in the work that I do. Using less color is actually a really, really big benefit to accessibility, but it's also a big benefit to usability because, I don't know, I can't tell you how many pie charts or how many bar charts is a better example that I've seen where every single bar is a different color. And no one really needs that. It doesn't make any sense and it just adds noise. And then it actually makes that bar chart inaccessible because you still have to label it anyway.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. It was so wonderful.
Thank you.
Hey, you. Yes, you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Paths from LGBT Tech. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe to never miss another episode. Show your support and allow us to keep sharing these stories. Didn't get enough? Check out past interviews to hear from more amazing queer professionals in science, technology, engineering, art, and math. See you next time.